Volume 1, The Sleeping Force Chapter 4, Training Session on Winter Mornings in Nottingham. The sun rises late. The streets are already bustling with commuters, all hurrying off to work. Even the international students are off to school. This is a city both ancient and youthful, teeming with vitality far from the weariness of industrial towns like Manchester and Liverpool. Yawning, Dunn trudged along the sidewalk. Groups of young people hurried past him, their energy a stark contrast to his own lethargy watching their youthful backs. Dunn couldn't help but grumble inwardly about the burdens left by his predecessor's worn-out body. It was like that rigid schedule he had to follow. At 6:30 a.m., his eyes opened on their own, only to find sleep elusive thereafter. He knew it was the time for Tony's morning run. But the truth was, he simply didn't feel like running at that hour. Such routines had ceased the moment he had passed his physical fitness exam in high school. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he wasted time until 7 a.m. before dragging himself out to prepare a quick meal. Then, he idled away another 20 minutes, eventually deciding to go to work at 7:40 a.m. Direct consequence of his insufficient sleep was that he couldn't stop yawning. Combined with the chilly drizzle outside and the biting morning cold, wrapped in his black coat, he looked like a disheveled addict. 20 minutes later, as he arrived at the entrance of the training facility, he was taken aback. Checking his watch, he saw that it was just after 8 a.m. Why is it so quiet? Is the New Year's holiday not over? Dunn muttered, puzzled. The gate before him was eerily empty, to the point where the few sparrows that had been perched flew away as soon as his footsteps disturbed their rest. Even more surprised was the gatekeeper, Ian McDonald. Tony, training doesn't start until later. Or what time does it start? Dunn asked, suddenly realizing how clueless he was at this point. He could only blame his concussion for his ignorance. 9 o'clock, Ian said sympathetically, giving him a look that spoke volumes. But Dunn, who disliked being seen as manly incompetent, shot Ian a glare. Great, so I didn't come too early after all. Of course not. Ian unlocked the gate and stepped inside, a thrill running through him. This was his first time at a professional team's training facility, and he couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. However, a voice interrupted his moment of elation, spoiling his mood. Tony, your office is the third white building on the left. It has a large floor-to-ceiling window. Dunn turned and curtly nodded. Thanks, Ian. That I know the way indeed. He knew the way. Tony Dunn's memories were still alive within him, and everything here felt remarkably familiar. With no sense of strangeness upon entering his office, Dunn flipped on the fluorescent lights. The once dim room was instantly bathed in harsh light, a stark contrast that made him squint in discomfort. The first thing that caught his eye was a large, dark-red desk, littered with only a computer, a pen holder, a phone, and a few books. Behind it sat a large swivel chair, clearly his designated seat. The furniture looked aged, bearing the marks of time, evoking a sense of history. Dunn shrugged. Such was English football. So obsessed with its history, he walked over, plopped down into the chair, and spun it around a few times. Looking around at the well-kept office and the empty training field outside, one feeling settled in satisfaction. He chuckled to himself. Who would have thought I'd be sitting here as the head coach of a professional football team? Those who used to mock me in the pub and tea house. Imagine their faces if they knew Tony Dunn was sitting in the Nottingham Forest FC coach's seat. He scratched at his shoulders low. But suddenly, his smile faded, and with great seriousness, he turned to the door and muttered in a deep voice, Mr. Chairman, I promise I'll bring you a shining trophy by the end of this season. Yes, I promise. Then, he stood up, turned toward the training field, and began to ponder. I think number 7's off his game. Should we send him to the reserves? Raising his voice dramatically, he waved his arms. Idiot, cut inside. Don't just stay on the wing. Did you not sleep last night? Cut inside, shoot, slice through their defenses like a knife, tear them apart. Resolve the game quickly and decisively, fool. Afterward, Dunn dropped his arms, feeling a sense of emptiness. Despite the title of coach, he was still a rookie. He didn't even know his own team, and this was his first day of training. His heart was filled with unease and anxiety. He wondered how his players would view him. This newly appointed coach who had embarrassed himself, would they mock him? Would they look down on him? Would they harbor quiet contempt? He felt like a fresh graduate nervously awaiting an interview. When his entire future was at stake, Dunn sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the training field. How long would he remain in this position? Maybe a week, maybe two, perhaps until the season ends. That would be a good outcome. An inexperienced, clueless rookie head coach, facing immense challenges, would he succeed? A knock on the door startled Dunn from his thoughts. He turned, unsure of who would come for him at this moment. Straightening his posture and putting on what he thought was the most fitting expression, he cleared his throat. Come in. The door swung open, and a dozen people poured into the office. What had been a fairly spacious room suddenly felt cramped. What's going on? Dunn was confused, unsure of the reason for their arrival. Of young man who had urged him to return to the pitch yesterday stepped forward. Tony, Chairman Daly felt it was necessary to reintroduce your colleagues. Dunn thought back to the moment at the training facility when the elderly chairman had patted his shoulder and said, "I won't pressure you." Tony, the old man, seemed well-intentioned. Did this seem, was it a bit too formal? I appreciate the chairman's thoughtfulness, but honestly, I don't need it, Dunn said. Observing the crowd, he noticed a few fleeting smiles of mockery. To quickly dismiss them, "You can all go back to what training's about to start." He gestured to his watch group, hesitated before dispersing, but the young man stayed behind as the last person left the office. Dunn shut the door and addressed the young man. "I know you're trying to help, but doing this puts me in an awkward position." Dave Walker looked puzzled. "Why? I'm the coach, the manager in front of them, and the players. I must maintain my authority and dignity. To be honest, I'm already tired of being looked at like I'm some kind of lunar quitter. It's sympathy or mockery. It's all the same. How can I lead the team like this? The players won't listen to a coach who constantly needs others to remind him of everything." Dave Walker was no fool. He understood Dunn's meaning instantly. "Sorry, Tony. I didn't think it through. I told you. I don't blame you right now. You're the only one I can trust," Dunn said, his gaze turning to the door. "They're all just waiting for me to make a fool of myself. You have to help me." At the end of the previous season, Walker had announced his retirement now. At 37, he found himself serving as the first-team assistant coach, all thanks to the encouragement and mentorship of Tony, Dunn's former coach. Paul Hart, it was Hart who had suggested Walker transition into coaching. After his retirement, a man of strong emotions, Walker felt a deep sense of gratitude for Hart, and with Hart stepping down, John Hart had taken the reins as head coach. Walker hoped Dunn would succeed, proving Hart's judgment had been shown. Moreover, helping Dunn was helping himself. After his retirement, Walker had no name in the coaching world, no experience, and working under Dunn was an excellent opportunity to gain that experience. Finding a respectable job after retirement wasn't an easy feat in these times. Walker nodded. "No problem. What do you need help with?" Dunn pointed to his head. "This thing still isn't quite right. Sometimes it just short circuits. You're by my side. Just remind me when necessary." To do it gently, Walker acknowledged with a nod. Then he asked, "So, what about today's training plan? You arrange it?" Dunn replied. Walker was taken aback for a moment, then quickly recovered. "All right. Then I'll follow the usual plan." That's the one," Dunn chuckled. "We work in perfect harmony." Walker shrugged. "I always feel like I'm fooling someone." "Oh, don't worry about that feeling. Sometimes deception is a good thing. Like when you deceive for a noble cause, that's not deception. That's a white lie. When it's time for training, I'll be on the sidelines watching unless it's absolutely necessary. I won't say much. You take the lead. Go on. Get ready. It's almost 9. They'll be here soon." Walker, seeing how precisely Dunn had spoken about the time training was to begin, felt reassured that Dunn was indeed beginning to recover some of his usual sharpness. He nodded and left to prepare as the door closed behind him. Dunn sighed with relief. Deception wasn't ideal, and getting caught was one thing. He feared the day when his blood thoughts might spill out unintentionally. That would be a disaster. Tony Dunn, everyone knew, was the old, stiff, medieval man he didn't want to change for the sake of filling others' expectations. He was, after all, a hot-tempered, stubborn, uncouth, rough around the edges man. He wanted to show them that this was the true Dunn. As for the old Tony Dunn, well, let him fade away with that collision at the sideline. He didn't have the luxury of caring about where he went, nor would he feel guilty about it. After all, he had lost a great deal himself. Then this weather. His gaze shifted outside. and he realized the rain had stopped on the previously empty training field. The groundskeepers were already out, inspecting the turfing day off. Train players were following the usual training schedule, but their minds were on their coach, Tony Dunn. Standing on the sidelines, there were frequent glances in his direction during drills. It wasn't just the players who acted strangely. Coaches on the field were also unable to suppress their curious attendant appearance, as the head coach was undeniably odd, and anyone who saw him couldn't help but stare a little longer. Wore dark sunglasses, paired with all black attire, black jacket, black pants, black shoes. From head to toe, standing on the sideline, his face remained stern, exuding an air of foreboding. The grey sky behind him seemed to deepen the atmosphere, and anyone who passed him felt as if a chill ran through the air. Evan Walker had not anticipated that Dunn would show up looking like this. The Tony Dunn of the past would have been in a neat tracksuit, whistle hanging around his neck, running laps with the players. But now, he resembled more of a club president than a coach. Don't even think about expecting him to demonstrate moves. This was exactly the effect Dunn wanted. His concern was that the coaching staff might ask him to demonstrate physical drills, something he couldn't do. He'd watched enough football over the years. But playing, that was a disaster, so he dressed like this, making it crystal clear to anyone with ulterior motives. He wasn't stepping onto the field. The sunglasses also hid his eyes, ensuring no one could see what was on his mind. Walker was considerate, raising his voice during training, calling out the players' names more than usual. In contrast, another assistant coach, Ian Bowyer, was less involved. He was among the ones who had sneered in Dunn's office earlier. According to Walker, Bowyer was a club veteran, a player for many years before retiring and becoming a coach. He had considerable seniority now. Dunn understood after Paul Hurt's dismissal. Bowyer likely thought the club would appoint him as head coach, only to have Hart recommend Dunn instead, leaving the old man envious. Such feelings were natural. Dunn understood, but that didn't mean he would back down. Dunn had never admitted defeat in front of anyone. If, 2 days ago, someone had suggested he step down, he would have gladly welcomed the release. If things were different now, since he had taken this role, he had to leave his mark, do something, leave a legacy. This was both a challenge and an opportunity. He had often imagined, while watching football, what he would do if he were the coach, and he played enough football manager games to know a thing or two. Standing on the sidelines now, he appeared like a post, but in reality, he was carefully matching Walker's calls to the players on the field. The player with the small braids, resembling the style of Rickard, was David Johnson, the forward who had collided with him at the sidelines the other day. Watching him on the field, he showed decent speed and good explosive power. For now, it was only a surface-level impression. More would be learned through matches. The small player who had just delivered a beautiful cross was Andy Reid, an excellent young player. Dunn himself had developed. Reid had just been promoted to the first team before the new year. Dunn glanced at him again, recalling that, in his memory, Reid had later joined Tottenham Hotspur. To think he came from Nottingham Forest. His talent was clear, as no Premier League club would recruit a player without ability. Since Reid was mentioned, Dunn's attention shifted to the backfield. Among the players practicing headers, one tall figure caught his eye with bright blonde hair, a youthful face, and a sharp look. He exuded a commanding presence. Even the defensive drills were structured around him. This was Michael Dawson, the centre-back hailed as Nottingham's future hope. Along with Reid, he had joined the first team after their mentor Hart. Just 2 days ago, he had made his league debut. But despite the team's heavy loss, his spirits remained high, his face lit with a smile full of optimism. Dawson was a key figure in the team, and 2 years later, he would leave Nottingham Forest with Reid for Tottenham Hotspur. John had watched a few of Dawson's matches for Tottenham and was impressed by his synergy with Ledley King in defense. At such a young age, he was already commanding the entire backline. He had even been a mainstay for the England youth team, with national team prospects looming in the future. But that would be a story for 2007. For now, Dawson was just a young lad full of hope, thinking that this player was one of his own. Dunn couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He didn't care whose Tony Dunn was responsible now. It was all on him. Continue to observe the team's training, memorizing the players' names, appearances, and technical traits, while also knowing the team's style and methods. He couldn't afford to ask too many questions, as it might expose him as the rookie he truly was, and worse, he might be sent off to a hospital as a case of amnesia from what he had observed. Nottingham Forest's squad was far from weak. Many players had standout qualities, and this team, placed in the second-tier league of England, certainly had the potential to rise to the Premier League. Yet, halfway through the season, they sat 10th in the league. Far from their initial goal of a championship was still, the club's financial situation was dire after selling Genius to Newcastle. Most of the transfer income had gone to settle debts, leaving very little for new acquisitions. Hart had already lost confidence in the team's ability to meet the chairman's goals at the halfway point of the season. They had 10 wins, 8 draws, and 9 losses. Although Dunn had never witnessed Hart coach a match, he believed in Hart's abilities. A coach who had produced so many outstanding players shouldn't be questioned. Even with the loss of players like Genius, the team's quality shouldn't have dropped this low. The issue wasn't with the players' ability. So, what was the root of the problem? Dunn noticed the players were still glancing at him though Walker was leading the training. Their attention seemed to be on the outsider. Dunn, from their gazes, he saw something he had become all too familiar with over the past 2 days. He didn't like the feeling of being regarded as some kind of spectacle. Suddenly, his voice rang out across the training field. "Hey, are you at the zoo? Where are your eyes looking? Pay attention to your training. Stop staring at me." Now, he truly had become the spectacle of the zoo. Everyone turned to look at the angry coach. What they had thought was a passive, stoic figure suddenly exploded in fury, shocking everyone. But what astonished them even more was that the typically reserved and methodical Tony Dunn, who never raised his voice, was speaking with such intensity and passion. Perhaps, just perhaps, that Tony Dunn was no longer the man he used to be, because tomorrow marked match day. The training intensity for the day was relatively light. Double sessions were only scheduled for midweek, and even then, only if there were no back-to-back matches within the week. After the morning training session, Walker dismissed the players to go home. The staff, like the players, gradually left once training had concluded, and Walker followed Dunn back to his office. Having watched this morning's training, any thoughts? Without waiting for Dunn to indicate, Walker entered and casually took a seat. Asking the question, he noticed that Dunn seemed far more approachable than before, no longer silent and withdrawn, now capable of laughing and even shouting. A refreshing change. Dunn, of course, could not express the multitude of doubts churning in his mind. After all, his position was no longer that of a newcomer observing the team's training for the first time, but as a coach who had risen from within the team, someone who should know every detail about it. Even after the head injury, he should have retained this knowledge. Aside from a lack of focus, everything was fine. Dunn answered Walker, then noticed that Dunn was without his usual notebook. "Didn't you write anything down? Where's your notebook?" he asked, gesturing to Dunn's empty hands, then pointed to his head. "I keep it here." He was not lying. Dunn had always had an excellent memory. Though he had never been a favorite of his teachers, his grades were always respectable. Walker shook his head and laughed. "Seems like a huge change. I'm starting to wonder if the person standing in front of me is really Tony Dunn." Dunn saw this as an opportunity to gently ease others into accepting his new self. Though he couldn't be too direct about it, he feigned surprise. "Oh, some things I can't really explain. Did they just happen? Isn't that all right? Should I go back to how I was before?" No, Walker quickly interrupted. "This is great. Really, you're far easier to get along with now than you were before." Dunn smirked inwardly. This was exactly the result he wanted. He needed someone to introduce his new self to the others, and no one was better suited for this role than Walker, who had been with the team for over a decade. After sending Walker on his way, Dunn began rummaging through his office. Walker had mentioned the notebook, so he decided to retrieve it and take a look. Perhaps it would offer some insight. In the third drawer of his desk, he finally found the worn-out notebook. It was only slightly smaller than a tactical board, but thick and heavy. The black leather cover had worn edges, the corners were frayed, and the gold-lettered notebook on the cover had become faded and chipped from years of use. It had clearly been well-loved over time. Dunn carefully opened the thick notebook, mindful of the possibility of pages falling out or the fragile book falling apart in his hands. Truly a person from the Middle Ages. Dunn muttered with slight derision in today's digital age. People still use paper notebooks. A laptop would be far more convenient, sleek, stylish, and it could even impress people at a cafe. Just imagine sitting at a window-side table in Starbucks, sipping coffee, ignoring the hustle and bustle around, your fingers dancing over the keyboard, the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. Dunn shook his head, snapping himself out of such an absurd fantasy. He had never been to Starbucks. People like him, scraping by on minimum wage, lacked both the financial means and the leisure to visit coffee shops. For him, it was more likely to be a pub where he could watch football, or a bustling tea house in Chengdu. Opening the cover, he found a neatly written inscription on the first page. Although the ink had faded with time, the words were still clear. Football is not about life and death. Football is more important than life and death. Upon reading this, the sneer on Dunn's face slowly faded away. As a football fan, he recognized the significance of these words. Understanding their weight, only a true fan could fully grasp their meaning. Football had ceased to be just a sport or a game. It had become a religion, a faith that had permeated the lives, the very veins of its supporters. It was surprising to see that the old Tony had written such a phrase in his notebook. It was clear how much he admired these words, to the point of considering them his personal football motto. Dunn had never imagined that the seemingly stoic, taciturn man from the Middle Ages would hold such an emotionally intense, almost irrational quote. Perhaps the real Tony was not as grim as people thought. Perhaps deep within him, there burned an unquenchable fire. Flipped through the notebook, compared to the rigid and unyielding schedule pinned to his refrigerator at home, this notebook's contents were far more disorganized. Without time stamps, it was impossible to discern the order of the entries. Some notes were scribbled in the margins, the handwriting messy and hasty, showing signs of being jotted down whenever a thought came to mind, regardless of the place. The first entry was dated March 21, 1998, and the last one was December 31, 2002. Flipping to the next page, Dunn found the notebook had come to an end. The final entry, from December 31, 2002, was filled with notes on the upcoming opponent, Warsaw, and his strategies. He had calculated many possibilities and countermeasures, yet never had he accounted for the arrival of another Tony. Dunn sign. Dunn closed the notebook. He had no intention of adding anything to it. There was simply no space left, and he didn't want to disturb the work of someone else. Holding the notebook in his hands, he felt its weight, a reminder of the past that he now carried with him. Volume 1, The Sleeping Force, Chapter 5. This is professional football. That night, Tony found himself once again unable to sleep since his arrival in Nottingham. He had endured 3 sleepless nights in a row. The first 2 were plagued by the unsettling uncertainty of the future. But this night's insomnia was unrelated to such trivial concerns. After this night passed, he would face his first true professional match as a coach. A once ordinary football fan who had only been able to excitedly watch matches on television. A pitiable man who could only channel his fervent passion for football through video games. A lonely virgin with no romantic prospects, who had channeled all his energy into the game, had somehow been given the opportunity to stand on the professional football field, to command players who, in his eyes, once seemed so remarkable and intimidating, to revel in the deafening cheers of the crowd, and to be interviewed by the media after the match. No matter what he said, his words would carry influence. To Tony, it felt like a dream. This was not Football Manager or Championship Manager, but a true, miraculous event unfolding before his very eyes. The thought of tomorrow's match filled him with a mix of nervous excitement, and he could not sleep. He lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, imagining how he would present himself the next day. Was unaware of the hour at which he finally fell asleep, but he knew it wasn't enough. From the moment he awoke, yawns plagued him. Dressing, washing, eating breakfast, and even the walk to the training ground were all accompanied by the same involuntary exhaustion. At the gates of the Wilford Training Complex, Ian MacDonald, the gatekeeper, was surprised for the 3rd time to see the team's new coach so early in the morning. "Tony," he began. But Tony interrupted him before he could finish. "I know, the match isn't until the afternoon. No training in the morning. I just want to start my work now. Is that all right, huh?" Tony stifled another yawn. Of course, no problem," MacDonald said. Opening the heavy iron gate for him as Tony walked past him, he heard MacDonald wish him luck. Good luck, Tony. Tony stopped in his tracks, turning back to face the elderly man. MacDonald, now living comfortably on his government pension after retirement, continued to work here for a modest sum of £100 a month after the club's financial troubles. Even that meager salary was no longer paid. He worked here simply out of love for the club, for the team, and he regarded his position as an honor. He treated everyone with respect, always polite and courteous, observing the players, coaches, and occasionally the chairman who passed through the gates. Never once complaining, even when the team's results were dismal. MacDonald was caught off guard by the intensity of Tony's gaze in the past. Tony had been quiet and gentle with everyone, always offering a polite glance followed by a small bow and a brief word of greeting before walking away. But now, those eyes fiery and unsettling seemed to pierce through him. MacDonald did not know that back in China, Tony's sharp, almost impolite gaze had earned him disdain from others. That Tony had never been inclined to change his nature. As MacDonald shifted uneasily under Tony's gaze, Tony suddenly broke into a wide grin. Ian, do you like victory? MacDonald blinked, then nodded in surprise. Of course, who doesn't like winning? Tony's smile grew even brighter, his lips nearly reaching his ears. Me too. Where will you be watching the match from? MacDonald pointed toward the guard's booth behind him. I'll be here, listening to the radio. Just like at the city ground. Tony nodded thoughtfully. I hope you keep hearing us score from that radio. Goodbye, and good luck, Ian. Goodbye. MacDonald stood frozen, watching Tony walk away. He was still trying to process the conversation, having never seen Tony so talkative, so full of life. And wearing such an obvious smile count a blow to the head really changed someone's personality this much. Pondering the thought, MacDonald absent-mindedly rubbed the back of his own head despite the recent devastating 3-0 loss in their last league match. The fans of Nottingham Forest displayed immense enthusiasm for the upcoming FA Cup fixture. The match would not kick off until after 3 in the afternoon, but by the time lunch had been finished, people were already beginning to gather from all quarters towards the city ground. Situated by the river trend across the river, there was another football stadium. Just across from them, the home of Forest's fiercest local rivals, Notts County and Meadow Lane. The two stadiums were merely 300 yards apart, perhaps the closest rival stadiums in the world. Like most English cities, Nottingham boasts the professional teams, both of which are historically notable. Forest, founded in 1865, and their city nemesis, Notts County, founded in 1862, are recognized as among the 4 oldest football clubs in the world, alongside Stoke City 1863 and Chesterfield 1866. Incidentally, the famous kits worn by Juventus and Arsenal today can trace their origins back to these 2 Nottingham clubs. Juventus's iconic black and white striped shirts were inspired by Notts County, who gifted their kit to the Italian club Arsenal. 2 shares a deep connection with Nottingham Forest from its inception. Its founders were 2 players from Forest, Freddie Beardsley and Maurice Bates. On the club's founding day, Beardsley leveraged his connections to procure a set of shirts from Nottingham Forest, which led to Arsenal's red kits, identical to those of Forest, until 1925 when they adopted their classic red and white design. In the early history of English football, these 2 Nottingham clubs were immensely successful, both having won the FA Cup. However, as time went on, their paths diverged. Notts County, grounded in a working-class mining community, struggled due to a lack of financial backing, while Nottingham Forest, representing the city's middle class, enjoyed a glorious chapter in the late 1970s under the legendary manager Brian Clough. The team experienced the meteoric recent miracle of Kaiserslautern is impressive, right? A club promoted from the 2nd division to the 1st in their very first season. Winning the top flight league title, Clough's team achieved something similar 20 years earlier. Promoted to the 1st division, the highest tier at the time, akin to the modern Premier League, from 3rd place in the 2nd division, and began their legendary domination of English football in their first season in the top tier. Forest triumphed with an incredible record of 25 wins, 14 draws, and only 3 losses, amassing 64 points back when the world still followed the 2-point system, where a win earned 2 points, a draw 1, and a loss none, becoming league champions. In the 1970s, Liverpool was the dominant force in both English and European football, the only team that could truly challenge them. The only team to defeat Liverpool 3 times in a single year. The only team that struck fear into Liverpool's heart was Nottingham Forest, also donning red after winning the league title. Forest went on to defeat reigning champions Liverpool in their opening European Cup match of the season and ultimately triumph over the Swedish underdogs Mount. Claiming the crown of European champions in the 1979-1980 season, Forest successfully defended their European title, beating Hamburg, whose team included the European Footballer of the Year and England's top scorer, Kevin Keegan. What is even more remarkable is that between November 26, 1977, when they drew 0-0 with West Bromwich Albion, and December 9, 1978, when they lost 0-2 to Liverpool, Clubs Forest set an unparalleled record of 40 consecutive undefeated matches in the top tier of English football. This record stood for 26 years before being surpassed by Arsenal's Arsenal, who went on to record 49 consecutive unbeaten matches in the new century. Of course, history is always glorious, especially in England, the birthplace of modern football. Why such grandeur is hardly surprising in stark contrast to their past glory. However, both Nottingham Forest and Notts County now find themselves in a state of painful decline. Notts County, long plagued by financial crises, even spent 18 months under receivership at the turn of the century before a consortium and a match against Chelsea in the FA Cup saved them. Chelsea agreed to donate all ticket revenue from the match to support the oldest football club in the world. Forest's situation is slightly better, but their storied history casts a long shadow. Fans, nostalgic for past triumphs, often suffer delusions, believing that the team is entitled to the same level of success as before, rather than accepting their place in lower leagues and descending into the same misery as Notts County. These days, even facing a team like West Ham, Forest feels lacking in confidence. Despite West Ham's less illustrious history compared to their own, this FA Cup third-round match, originally not scheduled for television broadcast, had been chosen for live coverage by the BBC. Given the state of both teams and their desperate need for a win, the BBC saw it as a match with ample drama and, of course, Tony Dunn himself was part of the spectacle, having just become the first coach in English football history to be injured by one of his own players during a match. The weather today was pleasant, with the sun shining brightly, making it hard to believe it was winter. A stark contrast to the persistent rains of the past few days as Tony stepped off the team bus. The brilliance of the sunlight forced him to squint his eyes. A bit dazzled by the glory of the head coach, he was the second to exit the bus, the first to step out. His assistant coach Dave Walker was greeted with raucous applause and cheers from the fans, who chanted his name in unison, having served Nottingham Forest for many years. Walker was also one of the last witnesses to the club's past glories, making such reverence from the fans understandable enough. As soon as Tony's feet touched the ground, he was met with a chorus of harsh boos. Raising his gaze, he quickly identified the ringleader of the jeers, none other than the group of middle-aged men with whom he had clashed at Burns's pub. He instantly recognized the man leading the boos, particularly due to the conspicuous bandage on his forehead, which added a comical touch that caught everyone's eye. Walker, clearly not expecting such a reception for the head coach, stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Likewise, Michael Dawson, who was just about to disembark, stopped in his tracks with one foot still hanging in the air, stunned by the sudden eruption of boos, and looked up at the fans, convinced they were booing him. It was Tony who reached up and pulled Dawson down from the bus, and as the team's no hope made his way into the stadium, the boos abruptly ceased. But what followed was a moment of deep discomfort for the fans. Dawson, a beloved figure, deserved a reception of cheers and applause. But the situation was complicated by the fact that the person who had just helped him off the bus was the very same person they had been booing. Tony, if they cheered now, would it be seen as praise for him? Tony smiled inwardly at the unfolding scene. His predictions proven right, he gave Dawson a pat on the shoulder, signaling for him to head to the locker room. As the fans saw Dawson leaving Tony's side, they readied themselves to resume their boos. But just then, Tony stepped back on the bus and pulled out another young talent. Andy Reid, another promising star of the team. The fans, who had just begun to raise their hands, suddenly stopped. Watching the fans' awkward expressions, Tony couldn't help but break into a wide grin. Reid, puzzled by his coach's unusual enthusiasm in personally assisting them off the bus, asked, "Boss, what's got you grinning?" Tony glanced at the fans and replied, "Nothing much, I just think we might actually win today, this time." He didn't let Reid leave his side. Together, they walked into the narrow tunnel leading to the locker room, with the fans repeatedly bringing their fingers to their mouths, only to falter at the last moment, unable to boo that sly fox. The leader, Michael, muttered in frustration, punching the iron railing in front of him. Tony's behavior over the past few days had been somewhat uncharacteristic, strictly speaking. Over the past 4 days since the January 1st match, when David Johansson had knocked him to the ground, he had been acting far from his usual self. His transformation was striking. Gone was the usually silent, somewhat brooding Tony Dunn now. He seemed like an entirely different person. The players couldn't help but worry, wondering if the blow to his head had caused some kind of neurological damage. Would there be lingering effects, perhaps dementia, memory loss, or even a split personality? Thus, in the locker room, it wasn't the head coach, but assistant coach Dave Walker, who was delivering the tactical brief to the players. And no one found it odd. On the other hand, Ian Bowyer, sitting quietly in the corner, looked even more out of place. He, who usually handled such tasks, was now reduced to watching. As the younger Walker took over, it was obvious to anyone with eyes that, since Tony Dunn had moved up from the youth team to first-team manager, Bowyer had been deeply disappointed. It was entirely understandable. Bowyer had been with the club for a long time. Now 51 years old and the senior-most coach, he had been a key player in Forest's European Cup victories. But there was little overlap between him and Tony Dunn. Had worked under Paul Hart with the youth team, while Bowyer had always been an assistant with the first team. When Paul Hart was promoted to first-team manager, Bowyer had assumed the youth team role, while Tony had stayed with Hart. In fact, Tony Dunn's name had never appeared among Bowyer's previous coaches, including legends like Brian Clough, Frank Clark, and Stuart Purcell. Both worked within the same club. They had little interaction. The youth team and first-team training facilities were separated by a narrow alley, barely 5 meters wide, yet it felt like half of Nottingham itself stood between them. The taciturn Tony Dunn was uninterested in social events and gatherings, and the two barely exchanged more than a polite nod if they crossed paths at the training ground. No. In the locker room, this distance seemed even more palpable. Tony, as capable assistant Dave Walker, was coordinating the upcoming match, while Bowyer, sitting by the wall, merely observed the proceedings. Where was the real star of the show? Tony Dunn. He wasn't in the locker room. He was in the restroom. Aside from the 2 restaurants inside the locker rooms, City Ground boasted 10 other toilets of varying sizes, most of which were open to the public. The VIP section had 2, and the smallest one was reserved exclusively for the home team staff, where coaches could retreat to calm their nerves and perhaps smoke a cigarette before the match. And the tour section told her he had managed to quell much of his anxiety after spending the morning in relative calm. The sight of the neatly arranged jerseys and boots in the locker room caused his heart to race uncontrollably. In that instant, he found a flimsy excuse to make himself scarce, passing the responsibility to Walker as he quietly slipped away to find some solitude. The staff restroom was tucked away in a quiet corner beneath the main stand of the stadium, rarely frequented by anyone. Through a small glass window, he could still see the lush green pitch, shimmering under the sunlight, and the stands gradually filling with eager fans. Instinctively, Tony reached into his pocket for a cigarette, only to remember this. Tony Dunn didn't smoke or drink. He muttered under his breath, leaning back against the wall in resignation. This wasn't a football manager simulation game. This wasn't Championship Manager or Football Manager. This was real and actual professional league, with real teams, on a real planet. A loss couldn't be undone by reloading a save, and there was no adding a new manager to overcome a stubborn opponent. If he lost, perhaps this would be the most important match of his life in this game. There was no way out, not even with ALTF4. Isn't life just like this? People often say, if I had done this or that differently, things wouldn't have turned out like they did. But in a way, Tony had to thank fate for giving him the chance to reload, though it was only for 4 years, and the save wasn't even his own. But so what? Since this body was now his, he had to give it his all, without letting time slip away again. In a sense, He added to the previous owner of his body to make the most of it at that moment. Faint singeing floated in from outside, reminiscent of the kind of chants Tony had seen during TV broadcasts. Though quieter, he paused to listen, curious about what they were singing, that just as quickly, the melody was drowned out by cheers. Tony withdrew his head, offering a wry smile suitor functionally had realized, almost without noticing, that his nervousness had faded. What remained was a sense of anticipation for what was to come. With one last glance at the pitch and the stands, he turned and made his way toward the team's locker room. Professional football. Here I come. Volume 1, The Sleeping Force, Chapter 6, 3 goals. Daniel MacDonald, the elderly gatekeeper at the Wilford training ground, had already tuned in his radio before the match began, cranking the volume to the maximum as he settled into his post in a small guardroom to listen intently. The players on the team's official roster were already at the city ground, while those who hadn't made the cut were at home or elsewhere. The training facility was eerily quiet, with only the commentary from the radio breaking the silence. He could still remember the smile and promise that Tony Dunn had given him that morning. You hear the news of a scoring goal after goal on the radio. It filled him with anticipation. True enough, not long after the match began, he heard goal after goal being announced. Though these were not the goals of Nottingham Forest, it was West Ham's players finding the net within just half an hour. His beloved team had already conceded 3 goals to the visitors, sat frozen in disbelief, struggling to accept the grim reality. Jermaine Defoe with a shot. It as in, what a spectacular strike. Defoe receives the ball outside the box. He makes a surge, slits past. Could this be 2-0? Yes. Jermaine Defoe doubles his tally. West Ham lead 2-0. Unbelievable, unbelievable. A stunning volley from outside the box. Joko, just 21 years old. He's England's footballing future. That's West Ham's 3rd goal. They're completely dominating the match, while Forest are left with no chance. 3-0. This match is effectively over. Over, you bastard commentator. What are you talking about? The match has just started. We still have 60 minutes to turn it around. MacDonald had never believed in the capabilities of Tony Dunn more than he did now. He believed this man could keep his promise. He clenched his fist and waved it at the radio, as if he was standing in the stands at the city ground, joining the other fans in voicing their discontent toward the visiting team. Since becoming the gatekeeper at the training ground, it had been quite some time since he last attended a match at the City Ground. Stadium was nearly drowned out by boos. Tony was all too familiar with the sound of jeering. When he had first opened his eyes to this world 3 days ago, these very jeers had filled his ears. The boos weren't directed at West Ham, but at Nottingham Forest. In one corner at the stadium, a group of West Ham players in their jerseys were huddled together, celebrating their 3rd goal and their commanding lead in the game. Walker, sitting next to Tony, was clutching his head in frustration. He had organized everything for the match, from the pre-game preparation to the tactics. Tony had trusted him, and he had hoped to repay that trust with a victory. But now, with the first half not even over, the team was being humiliated. Scoreboard flashed 0-3 in blood-red digits. The middle finger directed at the coach's boss stood as tall and imposing as the towering trees in the Sherwood Forest to the northeast of Nottingham. The fans' anger wasn't just about the score. It was the performance of the players on the pitch. Tony watched the game from the sideline, keenly aware that, if he were a dedicated Forest fan, he too would be expressing his frustration with foul language and a raised middle finger. He even wondered if the 11 players on the pitch, like him, hadn't slept well the night before. Had they gone out for some late-night debauchery? Those bastards! He furrowed his brow, gnashing his teeth in resentment. What Tony didn't know was that, at that very moment, a camera was zooming in on his face, capturing his expression for the broadcast. The commentator was none other than John Motson, the famous BBC football commentator known for his sharp, passionate delivery. He had just lavished praise on Joko's brilliant goal. West Ham's 3rd of the match. Motson went on to declare, "This match is over, despite Forest's illustrious history. Today they're like helpless worms wriggling under Joko's boots, dreading the next wave of attacks that will come at any moment. Look at this Forest team, look at those red shirts. It's truly heartbreaking." Coach Tony Dunn seems just as dissatisfied with his team's performance. Well, he'd better do something about it. Stop grimacing on the bench as if you have a toothache. In fact, the only person we see frequently getting up to issue instructions is his assistant, Dave Walker, who's really in charge here. But who would expect a rookie manager, freshly retired from playing, to be able to guide a Premier League team to victory over a top-tier club? The pre-match doubts about Dunn's ability as a caretaker coach weren't unfounded up until now. He has failed to bring any change to the team. In fact, he's been less effective than his predecessor, Paul Hart, who, by the way, was the one who recommended Dunn to the chairman, Nigel Daly. I must say, Paul, you have an excellent eye for players, but when it comes to choosing managers, you still have some work to do. Had Tony heard this disparaging commentary, he might have launched into a heated argument with Maudson on the spot, but at that moment, his mind was consumed with the urgency of the situation. He needed to change the course of the game. He knew that West Ham was formidable. Just look at the names on their roster to know how powerful they were. But that was no excuse for Nottingham Forest to fail. There was only one reason for defeat. They hadn't done inordinate. Durstals turned his head toward him, as though he'd heard something, but didn't quite catch it. What? He asked at Northern. Tony shook his head. Tony, you've got to come up with something. This can't go on. Walker leaned in close to Tony's ear and whispered, Boyer's made up his mind to sit back and watch. I think he wouldn't mind if we lose this match. You're right. That old man's probably hoping for it, Tony replied, but right now, I'm out of ideas. Walker's face fell in disappointment. A manager couldn't afford to feel this helpless when a coach loses control of a situation. It's often the beginning of the end. Do you really think our defenders can hold off Joe Cole, Lee Bowyer, Dick Kenyon, and Jermaine Defoe? Walker shook his head. To be frank, his team simply couldn't match up against such a powerhouse. Just listen to the names on the field. Either seasoned stars with years of fame, or the promising new talents emerging from across England. And do you honestly think our forwards and midfielders can penetrate the defenses of Michael Carrick, Ian Pearce, Thomas Repka, and David James, and score? Walker continued to shake his head. This defensive line was national team caliber. James was England's goalkeeper, Repka a member of the Czech national team, and Carrick would, in 3 years, make a move to Manchester United. Throughout the first half, Forest's main strikers had only 3 chances to shoot, none of which even gave James a chance to warm up. West Ham United, with their fleet of talented players, effortlessly controlled the rhythm of the match, seizing possession and dictating the play. Forest had no choice but to chase after the ball, running aimlessly, expending energy and morale. Although West Ham had performed poorly in the Premier League, sitting near the bottom of the table with only 16 points from 21 matches, they were still able to assert their dominance against a team like Forest and vent their frustrations. Just 17 minutes into the match, West Ham took the lead. The lightning-fast young forward, Jermaine Defoe, breezed past Forest's clumsy defenders, scoring the opening goal. 5 minutes later, Defoe returned, once again using his speed to slip through the defense, doubling his tally. Watching this young prodigy, who would later join the England national team, display his skills on the pitch, Tony felt a strange sense of time overlapping. He knew the heights this young man would reach. What was most disheartening for Tony was the realization that today, facing such a formidable West Ham side, his Forest team had little hope. Yes, West Ham's players passed the ball casually on the pitch. Joe Cole even treated the sparse away supporters to a display of heel passes and dribbles. The laughter from the West Ham fans and the boos from other stands created a surreal feeling for Tony. Whose home ground is this, really? This situation enraged him. Though he hadn't personally been embarrassed on the field by Joe Cole and the others, he still felt insulted as the manager of this team. The blame for his players' poor performance on the pitch fell squarely on his shoulders. This was no different from being personally humiliated. Michael Dawson, Forest's hardest working player, was powerless to stop the tidal wave of West Ham's attacks. The responsibility for the 3 goals conceded wasn't his alone. It was the team's collective failure. After watching the first 30 minutes of the match, Tony decided that, in the next game, he would hand over the captain's armband to this young man. If a 21-year-old Joe Cole could captain the Hammers, West Ham's nickname, why not a 19-year-old Michael Dawson, a passionate young talent who had risen through the ranks of Forest's youth system? Who better to lead this team than him? The north stand of the city ground, nearest the Trent River, was home to Forest's most loyal supporters. At the top of the stand was a row of enclosed corridors, with 2 old yet tidy seats. To televisions, that was the club's box compared to the luxurious boxes of major clubs. Forest's box could only be described as meager. In such a dismal match, it was no surprise that no one would sit there to watch the game currently. Only 2 people occupied the box. They were not seated, but stood. Gazing out the large glass windows at the pitch were the club's chairman, Nigel Doughty, and his son, Evan Doughty. Evan glanced briefly at the television in the corner before turning his gaze to the field. Is this the team you love? The once glorious Nottingham Forest. His tone was laced with derision, a sharp contrast to the courteous demeanor of Kenny he had seen earlier. He directed these words to his father. To Nigel Doughty paid him no mind. Lost in the game, he continued speaking, his head nodding with each word. At halftime, come with me to the locker room. I need you to meet the players. Evan knew his words were once again dismissed by his father. I don't think it's necessary. And now isn't the right time for a meeting, he urged, hoping to dissuade his father from his plan to meet with the players and coaches. But Nigel Doughty didn't respond, completely engrossed in the match-driven side. Shoulders slumping, he had no interest in the one-sided match unfolding before him. Bored, he leaned back in his seat, crossed his legs, and sipped the coke provided by the stadium, idly surveying his surroundings. This shabby box, this modest stadium, this low-level competition, and this uninspiring team. He could never understand why his father had such an attachment to this team, why he was willing to invest millions, when he had never even invested that much in his own son. When Evan watched basketball in the NBA, he was first a Chicago Bulls fan, then a Los Angeles Lakers fan, and in the past year, he had even shown interest in the San Antonio Spurs. Despite living in Houston, the only reason for his frequent shifts in allegiance was that his previous team lacked enough star power and championships to him. It was incomprehensible, even absurd, that anyone could love a team without star players. Struggling even in the 5th tier of the league, what pleasure or benefit could they derive from such a team? Without the excitement of star performances, without trophies to savor, without victories to discuss over dinner, what joy could such fans possibly find? He glanced at the mass of heads in the stand across from him and the countless arms stretched out, waving such a dreadful match. Yet the seats were filled. He shook his head slightly. What exactly do thousands of people, like my father, hope to gain from this? Every weekend afternoon, sitting on the rudimentary stands of a modest stadium, wasting time, growing older by the minute. How pathetic. Mawson was puzzled after his conversation with Walker. Tony hadn't shown any reaction whatsoever. Even Walker, who had been animated before, seemed to have glued himself to his seat. The 2 of them sat in silence, simply staring at the field, saying nothing, doing nothing. This was strange after witnessing his team's pitiful performance. Weren't they worried? Didn't they feel angry? They had to show some emotion, didn't they? But now the camera lingered over their faces. Both Tony and Walker were absorbed in the game, not even a furrow in their brows, feeling embarrassed. Mawson muttered under his breath, did they just step out of Madame Tussauds? Glenn Roeder, the manager of West Ham United, was quite pleased with his team's performance. The lackluster first half of the season seemed to have been completely forgotten by these young men. He and Tony shared similar coaching paths. Both were brought in to save the day after the previous manager's poor record in this head-to-head battle of conscience. Roeder was clearly in the lead. This was his first match in charge, and the start was promising. He believed that, if his team could maintain this level of play in the second half of the season, survival would be assured. He stood at the sidelines, already contemplating the next Premier League match. Tony glanced at Roeder, who was standing at the edge of the field, orchestrating the game. His face, fair and smooth, framed by gold-rimmed glasses, looked quite dashing. Tony recognized him. He had known him before arriving. This man later became the manager of Newcastle. Before that, he had been in charge of their youth team. When Salas was dismissed for poor performance, Roeder was promoted to the first team. He had taken the most attractive position in the world. Yet his record had been far from impressive. Unlike his predecessor, he was luckier in that, when his team faltered, he could blame injuries and received full support from within the club. But eventually, he resigned due to poor results, and his team set an embarrassing record for Newcastle: 500 minutes without scoring at home. To Roeder's story so he wasn't intimidated by him. West Ham's good form had nothing to do with that polished, gentlemanly coach. It was all down to the talented players at his disposal, regardless of the players on the field. Just looking at the talent on West Ham's bench was enough to show the strength of his team. Trevor Sinclair, an England World Cup player in 2002. Conor Oite, a Mali international who later became a famous goal scorer in La Liga, helping Sevilla win 2 UEFA Cups and clinch the 2006-2007 Spanish double. Look at those names, then consider where they ended up in the league, third from the bottom, relegated after humiliating defeats 0-5 to Everton, 1-7 to Blackburn. The manager claimed that the poor performance was not his fault, but the result of his predecessor's poor signings, but his incompetence was not just the product of a few critics' opinions. The English media had been relentlessly critical of him after watching this first half. Tony believed the media's judgment was spot on. Tony shrugged. He had already figured out how to handle this team. That now was not the time for adjustments. There were only 5 minutes left until halftime, and once they reached the locker room, he would give these still sleepy players a good talking to. Suddenly, a loud, piercing chorus of boos reached his ears, followed by a string of insults. It was strange. The area behind him had been quiet until now. What had changed? He turned around to find the source of the noise. Michael and his group were making faces and gesturing obscene hand signs. From the stands behind him, the bandage on the man's forehead was so conspicuous, it was hard to miss. Go back to your youth team. This is the senior team, not a place for kids like you. Go back to your mommy and throw a tantrum, haha. Woo woo. The others around them joined in the jeering. Most of them were the same people who had mocked him at the bar the other day, with a few strangers. Clearly, they were all part of the same group. Walker, drawn by the ruckus from behind, stood up and shouted toward them, "Michael, what the hell are you doing?" Michael ignored Walker and tilted his head. "Jay, you'd better stay out of this. This is a personal grudge between me and the coach." "A personal grudge? You and a whole group of people have a personal grudge with one man?" Walker scoffed. "Enough. Don't bother with them," Tony said, pulling Walker down. "Tony, what's going on? I remember you never got into arguments with anyone, and Michael's a loyal Forest fan. Why do they hate you so much?" "It's nothing." I threw a drink in the face of the leader in Burns' bar, then had a little scuffle with him. Short and over quickly, I knocked him down with a punch, and then called the fat guy on the left fat pig. Tony spoke casually. The Walker's mouth fell open, as if he could swallow a football. From what he remembered, Tony had always detested alcohol and cigarettes and never got angry with others, let alone for what had happened. Tony, noticing Walker's surprise, could understand anyone familiar with him would be shocked by what he just said. "I'll explain later. For now, let's just watch the game. I've figured out how to deal with them." Walker glanted and racket. Anthony settled to get talked. An interesting feature of English stadiums was that the coaches' benches were rarely situated in the open area between the pitch and the stands. Unlike most stadiums that Tony was familiar with, their bench was actually placed in the stands, surrounded by regular fans. The players' tunnel led to the coaches' and substitutes' areas. Unless directing the game, the coaching staff would remain seated among the fans. Forest's home ground, City Ground, wasn't always like this. Their bench used to be below the stands, at pitch level, almost as though it were a dugout, with a cement roof for shade and protection from rain. However, after the 1996 European Championships in England, most English stadiums, including this one, were renovated to bring the coaching staff closer to the fans. This change had its pros and cons. For Tony, he was currently experiencing the downside. Sitting behind the bench, Michael and his group continuously taunted him with boos and all sorts of insults, pushing his patience to its limits. Even the substitute players couldn't help but stand up several times to stare back at them. But Tony remained resolutely focused on the game, ignoring the barrage of abuse. "You coward, an absolute wimp. Do you see this? I'm insulting you and your entire family. Come on, hit me again. Where's the courage you had when you hit me before? Useless bastard, son of a bitch, scumbag," Michael shouted, his voice carrying all the way to the camera. His words echoed over the stands, while Tony remained seated, arms crossed, less than 3 meters away. The scene of the boisterous taunts from the stands, with Tony sitting unfazed below, was broadcast into countless living rooms. Burns, who had been helping out at the bar, saw it too, and the pub erupted in cheers for Michael. Burns could only shake his head at the spectacle. Perhaps, just as Michael and the others mocked, Tony was indeed a coward and a wimp. Unable even to fight back, his behavior was disappointing to many of the players. To be honest, Michael's insults were so offensive that even the players who knew him couldn't tolerate them yet. Coach Tony remained in his seat, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard a single insult. Merson, observing this from the sidelines, grew excited. I've noticed something fascinating whenever Coach Tony Dunn is on the sidelines. The most exciting moments are not on the field, but within a 10-yard radius of his bench. There seems to be some commotion behind him. It looks like some fans are saying something to him, and judging by their agitated demeanor, it's certainly not praise. I think we should have a lip reading expert on tomorrow night's match of the day to figure out what they're saying. If West Ham were to win 3-0 away, there would be nothing remarkable to report. They should have won. This unexpected drama on the sidelines is definitely worth their attention. As the game continued, time slipped away, and Forest remained at a disadvantage. However, after taking a free goal lead, West Ham slowed down, choosing to leisurely pass the ball rather than aggressively push forward. Perhaps the players, like their coach, had already started thinking about their next Premier League match. Insults from behind the Forest bench continued unabated. Several players, uncomfortable, asked to warm up on the sidelines, seeking to escape the embarrassing atmosphere of the substitute bench. Tony made no comment, and walked aside, gesturing for all the substitutes to go warm up. The substitute bench quickly emptied, leaving only the coaching staff. Walker glanced at Tony with concern. He had been uneasy for a while, noticing Tony's strange behavior. His complexion seemed poor, clouded like the weather from a few days ago. When Walker's gaze dropped, he saw Tony's fists tightly clenched. The knuckles were white from the pressure. The referee's whistle came as a relief, signaling the end of the painful first half. Dunn was the first to stand and walk down from the bench, leaving the mocking fans behind. He entered the tunnel, his back to the taunts. Walker shot a stern glance at Michael's group before going to console the players as they exited the field. He patted one player, then another, shaking his head and sighing. He reassured them that losing 3-0 to a team like West Ham was understandable for all. "We're a championship team.